Good morning, my friends from BITS Pilani. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me for this talk. I understand you are carrying out a series of talks by different specialists, different experts on various subjects. I would think that for pure engineering students and students who are mainly into technical education, this is a commendable effort and initiative to have an understanding of various subjects beyond your own study material. And I thank you for that. And many thanks for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about, as decided between me and the organizers, about India's foreign policy priorities and where is India in the fast changing global churn that we are witnessing since, especially from since 2020, during and after the corona pandemic. And the foreign policy paradigm of India, where is it going? Is it dynamic enough? Is it something that derives its legacy from age-old stand that India has taken since its independence in 1947? All that will be discussed. But before that, I wanted to give you a short glimpse of what is the structure and what is the instrument or a mechanism with which India deals with other nations in its foreign policy approach. And of course, you know that there is the External Affairs Ministry, headed by the Minister of External Affairs, in this case, Dr. S. Jaishankar, a former Foreign Secretary turned the minister. Then, of course, he has three ministers of state for external affairs, but I've just given you a general diagram here of how this works. Not that this is not common knowledge, but it's always good to set some of the frameworks under which the ministry operates. So there is, as I said, EAM, External Affairs Minister, his three ministers of state. In this case, of course, it can be sometimes only one minister of state, as has been the case generally. But in this government, there are three ministers of state for external affairs because of India's growing footprints across the globe, as well as the workload that the ministry has to share, given India's increasing uh, relationships and increasing engagements with the world. Then there is a CEO kind of a appointment, which is the Foreign Secretary. He is head of the all bureaucracy under the Ministry of External Affairs. He's an experienced diplomat, a foreign service officer. Today, it is Vinay Mohan Quatra, a very experienced diplomat, known to have had extensive knowledge of India's foreign policy and, of course, exposure to various facets of foreign policy. Of course, he's also worked in the Prime Minister's office as Joint Secretary, looking after defense and foreign policy and atomic energy. So, comes with diverse and rich experience. Then, under him, there are these secretary level officers, where Secretary East looks after, as the name suggests, all the country, the relationships with the countries east of India. There is Secretary West, there is Secretary Economic Relations. You will agree that India's foreign policy component now consists mainly of economic diplomacy, beyond, of course, strategic affairs and the typical diplomatic engagements that India has been doing for now 76 years. Then there is Secretary Consular and Passports and Visa and Overseas Indian Affairs. And then there is Special Secretary for the upcoming many engagements that India does. So there are this apex structure in the External Affairs Ministry, which is the face of India's foreign policy. There are, of course, other ministries, other, um, I would say, other organizations like the National Security Council Secretariat, which also does parts of diplomacy behind the scenes. And then, of course, all those top officials are assisted by additional secretaries. And these are all acronyms you can find on the ministry's website: BIMSTEC, Indo-Pacific. There is, the development assistance. There is Africa. There is SARC. All those things keep happening. There are several summits that India holds, and therefore you have Indian Ocean and Summits Additional Secretary, and it goes on. But let's get to the uh, vast expanse under which India has to operate. And if you look at India's geographic location, remember, where we stand is determined by where we sit. And in this case, I am referring to India's geographic location. India's geographical location is, as you can see on the map, is actually very vital and very strategically placed in the map itself. There is Africa to its west, which is not very far. It also abuts the Indian Ocean. In fact, I'm going to talk about the Indo-Pacific as we go along. But if you look to India's west and east, there is the Gulf countries or the Arabia. These are this is an old map, of course. You must understand that I'm showing you an old map deliberately because these were the trade routes, ancient times, and India always had a pride of a place in those trade routes, which also determined that you did trade diplomacy first or trade relations first, and then diplomacy came in. So you have Arabia to its west, the Malacca Straits to the east, and then further down you go to southeast. There is Australia, and then you also have the Pacific Ocean to extreme east or far east, as we call it in this case. If we go to the next slide, then we'll realize that India, since its independence, has had several milestones in its foreign policy approach. So it began with Panchashil principles, five principles of peaceful coexistence, which India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had propounded, especially because India was a freshly independent country, had thrown off the yoke of colonialism, had driven out the British, as were other nations doing so in Asia and Africa at that point in time in the late 40s, early 50s. And this was based on India's deep rooted anti imperialism, anti colonialism principles, which were kind of juxtaposed or factored in the new Panchil principles. Then, of course, from there flowed the non-alignment uh, approach or non-alignment policy that India adopted under Jawaharlal Nehru, saying that we don't want to be part of any of the blocks that the Second World War, post Second World War world saw, where the West came under the leadership of the United States, and the Eastern European bloc came under the influence of the USSR or the Soviet Union. And then there were these two blocks. The Cold War began after the Second World War, post 1945. But India and some of the other nations like Yugoslavia, Cuba, and Egypt decided to go non-aligned, and therefore they launched a non-aligned movement or NAM in the late 50s, early 60s. But India was forced to tilt towards the USSR or the Soviet Union in 1971 because of the turbulent decade following India's military defeat, military diplomatic political defeat in 1962 by China. And it had to take the Soviet Union's help in prosecuting the 1971 war, which broke up Pakistan and created Bangladesh, as all of you are aware. Post Cold War is the period which was the most challenging for India because now there was a hegemony of the United States. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Eastern Bloc countries, the Central Asian republics, became independent. They came out of the influence or tried to come out of the influence of the Soviet Union. And therefore, India had to look for new paradigms. So the Look East policy was launched in 1991, soon after the collapse of the USSR in 1990, 89-90. And then Look East became Act East under the current government. You also have a state of affairs where India now, because of China's aggressive behavior and its predatory tactics around the neighborhood, India is now forced to align more with the US, having signed foundational agreements, uh, trying to take technology from US, also US help for intelligence and reconnaissance against China. So basically, hedging its India's bets against China through a multi-alignment policy. There was non-alignment, remember, in the 60s and the 70s, but now it's multi-alignment as a new mantra. which means that India will put its national interest above principles. Earlier, foreign policy was based on what was called a set of principles, moral, also rooted in some of the ancient thoughts that India has had, that we are not an aggressive nation, we are not aggressors, we are not expansionists like the Chinese, and therefore we will keep away from the bloc politics or the Cold War rivalry. But today, India has to choose its friendships, its strategic partnerships with care, but based on national interest. That means you can be friendly with Iran and Saudi Arabia, who were sworn enemies till the other day, and yet get both to give us whatever we wanted. India is friendly with Israel as well as with the Palestinians, and India is getting a lot of technology from the United States, but at the same time has not given up its ties with the USSR, or now the Russians. And this is what is a pragmatic foreign policy which is being pursued currently for the past a decade or so, because coinciding with Narendra Modi's rise as prime minister, the world has also rapidly evolved and changed and is in a churn, as we witness currently. As we go along, we'll now see what are India's foreign policy priorities. So, if you look at the foreign policy approach, we can list them, the new philosophy that earlier India always had a large military, nearly 1.5 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and officers, which constitutes the Indian military. But the military might was always kept as a reserve. India has had, of course, four wars with Pakistan, one war with China, and also battled insurgency in various forms, both in the northeast and in Kashmir. But when it came to the crunch, the military was always held back. Now, the new philosophy is that military might is of no use if it is not used in a way that can put pressure on your adversary and sends a message which deters the adversary from taking steps that are detrimental to India. Therefore, uh, you could see what happened in Uri, what happened in Nagaland or in Myanmar in 2015, Uri in 2016, Doklam in 2017, Ladakh in 2020, and Balakot in between in 2019. So the new approach is, and the new confidence is, that there is a military which you have built with a lot of capability. You have spent a lot of money. You have trained the military. There has to be a political will to use it when required, not necessary to use it all the time, but when required. And that's exactly what is being done today. Because if you look at the past, Pakistan and China have got away several times. Mumbai attack in 2008. Before that, the Parliament attack in 2001. After that, before that Parliament attack in 2001, and even the Chinese incursions at various places were left without a strong response, a military response. It was always about diplomacy, about talking, about negotiating. There was no cost imposed on these two countries earlier. But today, the new philosophy is that impose the cost first and then negotiate, or talk about discussions and engagements with this. So earlier there were red lines in the minds of the leadership. For instance, everybody told the political leadership, the strategic advisors, foreign policy advisors, that don't cross the line of control with Pakistan in Jammu and Kashmir. Don't go into Pakistan. Don't attack it like it happened in 2008 after the Mumbai attacks. That there was a contemplation, there was a plan ready with the Indian Air Force that they can go and bomb the Bhavalpur headquarter of Lashkar-e-Taiba. But at the last moment, the political leadership demurred. They hesitated because they said, oh, there will be retaliation, there will be a nuclear dimension that will come into play, and therefore these red lines remained in the mind. These red lines have now been uh, erased in a way by showing what you can do with operations like the land border, cross border raids in Uri or post Uri, and the air raids in Balakot post Pulwama in 2019. So, therefore, the new term called offensive defense. So, go on the offensive when required, but always have a strong defense to deter the challenger. Another change that has come into the Indian mindset on national security and foreign policy is that the Chinese are the main primary threat for India, not the Pakistanis. Pakistan is a subset of the China challenge. And therefore, now to take on the China challenge, there have been so many deliberate steps that have been taken. One is, of course, India is openly aligned with the Quad, or a group of four countries called the quadrilateral grouping, which is the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, which India so far has resisted from being taken into a military alliance. It is willing to engage with the Quad countries, or the group of four, or group of the four countries, or the other three, in areas like vaccines, resilient supply chains, space. All of those areas, India is cooperating with them very proactively. But at the same time, it is keeping the military dimension at a low profile, because India believes, and rightly so, that all its problems with China are bilateral and need to be tackled bilaterally, because India is the only country among those Quad countries, or the four countries of that grouping called the quadrilateral grouping, which has a disputed land boundary with China. So it has its own dynamics, own complications, and the other three will never be able to understand that, because they will always look at the China problem from their own prism, like India should. And therefore, India does engage with the Quad countries. It has added more complexities to the exercise Malabar, for instance, which is started as a bilateral exercise with the United States Navy and the Indian Navy, but has now expanded to include Japan as a third partner and Australia as the fourth partner, which is actually the Quad countries doing military exercise. Then there is this policy which Prime Minister Modi articulated in 2015 called Sagar, security and growth for all in the region, which encompasses the Indian Ocean region. I showed you India's map as India sits astride the sea lanes of communication. And when you look at it, uh, India is the fulcrum around which Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific strategies of different governments, including India, will revolve. And therefore, this policy called Sagar, security and growth for all in the region, is nothing but encouraging blue economy based on oceans, based on the fast changing paradigm of climate change, of rising sea levels, of trade flowing through these important sea lanes of communication. All that is happening. Therefore, India has decided to give more emphasis on the blue economy, and creating assets and alliances, partnerships with big and small countries in the Indo-Pacific, which stretches from the eastern shores of Africa to the western end of the Pacific, which goes right up to Japan and Australia. Therefore, there is a lot of cooperation on climate change, blue economy, trade ties, acting east. All that has happened. As we see, the change in the foreign policy is, it is proactive. It is based on a lot of security considerations. As I said, national interest. There is a security grid, which is much more seamless, much more cooperative. The number of intelligence agencies that India has, and the cooperation that they do with other countries, has become absolutely smooth and more, I would say, deliberate and uh, consultative, rather than taking unilateral actions. The hesitations of history, I have already spoken about. The history, the hesitation in the historical context used to be, don't annoy Pakistan because it has got nuclear weapons. It might bring nuclear weapons into play, and therefore we should be careful in not provoking Pakistan, which might launch attack which India doesn't want to face. But all those hesitations, even with China, the earlier approach was, let's talk diplomatically, and let's not develop infrastructure around the border areas along with China, or Tibet, actually, which should be called. So there was no progress, or very, very slow progress on infrastructure development along the Himalayan frontiers between, say, 2000 to about 2012-13. Nearly a decade was lost, or more than a decade was lost, in not building roads, not building infrastructure, airstrips, having habitats for troops. All that has set India back. But now all that has changed. We have broken the or overcome the hump. And today, the development speed with which tunnels are being constructed, roads are being built, all these things for taking on the Chinese has now acquired a momentum of its own. And that is going to be a game changer. And that is why China is putting so much pressure on India, because it knows it's got a very limited window. Over the next 3 or 4 years, India will catch up with China as far as the border infrastructure is concerned, and then it will be very difficult for China to put military pressure on India. It might put pressure in different ways, but India's military is now putting in place a robust defensive structure to begin with, and over the next 5 years, it will get into a position where it can even launch offensive actions in Tibet when required, which may not be a reality, because the Chinese also don't believe in fighting. They want to win without fighting. And that is why the military coercion that you are seeing in Ladakh. I wanted to also draw your attention to one fact. Anybody who's thinking that the Chinese pressure on the border in Ladakh is a prelude to a kinetic war or an all-out war breaking out between India and China, please don't have that illusion or that fear, because in the mountains, if the Chinese have to fight, or anybody has to fight in the mountains of as formidable as in the Himalayan frontier, then the ratio of the offensive force to defensive force has to be 9:1. That means if 9,000 Chinese troops come, uh, India will have to have only about 1,000, I mean, only 1,000 troops which can defend the border. But the offensive party, or the side that launches an offensive, will need 9 times the troops of a defensive force. And there is no way that the Chinese can bring in that kind of force in the higher reaches of Ladakh, or in the high altitudes of Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh or Sikkim. And therefore it is not an all-out war that is a possibility, but a military coercion and salami slicing, creeping tactics that the Chinese adopt will be the order of the day, as it is being shown in the last 3 years or so. Nevertheless, India is doing multi-alignment, as I mentioned. It is putting national interest first. It is one of the unspoken or um, unwritten policies has been looking west. That means India's relationship with the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, have never been as good as they are right now. They are one of India's strongest allies and staunchest supporters in the world. And therefore, this is another change that has come into Indian policy. What is being done? Well, reorienting the Indian security establishment of thinking of various options which can be a mix of offense and defense, as I mentioned earlier. The geographical advantage which comes to India from its land borders is being sought to be negated by taking advantage of India's position in the Indian Ocean region. In the Indian Ocean, the Indian peninsula juts nearly 2,000 kilometers, and that itself is a major advantage for any nation. Because if you look at the Andaman Nicobar group of islands, they are like stationary or land-based aircraft carriers. It is India's best bet as far as keeping the Chinese at bay or under pressure in Malacca Straits is concerned. The Indian Navy's mission-based deployment, where ships are going further afar, they're going right up to, say, the shores of Japan. They are frequently traveling to Africa, to the Western Gulf, I mean, the West Asian countries in the Gulf. And India is also coming into its own as far as the nuclear dimension is concerned. So, after the civil nuclear deal with the United States in 2006, India has also now joined some of these rule-making bodies or rule-making organizations like the MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, and the Wassenaar Group or the Australia Group, which determine how rules are made for use of nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, and are therefore an important uh, part of India's diplomacy and India's strategic outlook as far as the foreign policy is concerned. So, when you say making of India as a legitimate nuclear power, these organizations are important, and this is where China is trying to keep India at bay. But as concluding thoughts, let me also tell you three or four new things that have happened. As we speak, within a week or say less than 10 days, we will have the G20 summit being held in India. And India has acquired this presidentship of G20 by turn. Of course, it has come by turn. Each country in that grouping gets to preside over the grouping's annual summit and its annual functions. What India has done, interestingly, like Indonesia last year in 2022, is to utilize the presidentship of G20 for making common people aware of its status in the world. If you look at what has happened in the post Ukraine world, the Indian stock, as far as the world is concerned, has risen. How has it risen? I mentioned that India is keeping good relations with the Americans and the West in Europe, the Western world in Europe. At the same time, it is got its old ties with Russia, which it has not given up. In fact, it has taken a stand that initially did annoy the West and the liberal order, as they want to call themselves, because India said that we have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. It is a war for Europe, or European war with Asian consequences, as one of my seniors, MJ Akbar, has put it in one of his essays. But India said we cannot condemn Russia just because it has been the aggressor, because there are historical reasons why Russia has done this, and Russia appreciates that. So India has taken a very practical and pragmatic stand, which now the West has come to appreciate, and therefore the United States is also wanting to have good relations and help India in terms of technology, in terms of realignment in different technological regimes, and giving India new technology, emerging technologies. And so does France, which in many ways is like India, is not part of any camp, any alliance, and India has maintained its position of being a non-camp follower. India never has any alliance, is not an alliance member. If you remember, it was never part of the NATO, for instance, or the CENTO, as it used to be called earlier, or CETO. It has always remained non-aligned, but in this case, while remaining neutral, India is also taking advantage of its position of rising economy, of great demographic dividend. All of you are part of that demographic dividend, because 65% of India's population is below 35. And it is this youth bulge which attracts companies, economists, businesses to India, because this India is not just a huge market, but it's also a hub of talent pool. You are part of that elite talent pool, and remember that you have a limited window of another 20 to 25 years of taking advantage and taking India to the next level, making India the third largest economy. Ultimately, while economy can be an arbiter or a determinant of how a country is viewed, it has to be backed by hard power. And this is the approach which has paid dividends. That while one looks at economy, likes to grow at a faster pace economically, while distributing wealth equitably to its all people, all the citizens in India. India also has now deliberately adopted a strategy of make in India. Unless you have your own weapons, your own ammunition, your own technology, militarily, you cannot be a power to reckon with, which the Chinese have done very well between 1980 and now. But it's time that India does this. And it is here that students of BITS Pilani, all of you who are listening to this, will have to contribute, because next 25 years are crucial for India. By the time we celebrate 100 years of India's independence in 2047, India should be amongst the three top countries in technological terms, in economy, in military power, as well as a moral force, a moral compass for the world, which sort of goes by the ancient thought of what is called living in peace, harmony, and not being expansionist, not have aggressive designs on its neighbors or anybody. So India is not an expansionist power, and that is what will be a model that will attract the global south. India is gradually and without much effort, without being deliberately in your face, acquiring the leadership of the global south. And therefore, if you see India's memberships of different groupings, India is a member of the Quad. At the same time, it is an important member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, of course, initiated by the Chinese, and also an important element in BRICS, plus the new six nations who have joined BRICS, BRICS plus six, as it is going to be called. But BRICS is one of the groupings or one of the associations where India is a major player, apart from, of course, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That was the original grouping called BRICS. And just last week, as you would remember, BRICS is now being strengthened by inclusion of the two Arab countries, three Arab countries, in fact, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and the others who have joined in there, which means India is in a sweet spot. I just want to conclude with one thought. India is in a sweet spot, but to maintain this momentum that India has acquired over the past 5 or 6 years, especially after COVID, every country wants to partner with India to uh, have the advantage of having a good relationship with India. This is a limited window of 20 or 25 years. Then India's demography will also turn older. India's mean average age of population will also go higher. Today it is 28 years compared to Japan, which is nearly 48, China, which is 38. India will also eventually come to that stage. And therefore, my final thought to you and my final appeal to you, that take advantage of India as a rising power, India as a moral force in this world today, in a chaotic world that we live in, but at the same time acquire technology, acquire power, which will determine how this world is traveling over the next 25 years or so. So, once again, thank you very much for having me. I hope I was able to give you a glimpse of India's foreign policy and what it means to the world as well as to its citizens. Thank you for this opportunity and thank you for your time.